They called it the family plan. The son came out to the audience in the glitter of chandeliers, smiled for the cameras and said, "I remit $8,000 a month to my father." Applause slammed like hammers on a coffin lid. And I went home that night to a refrigerator with only an onion and a jug of water. On paper, I was a caregiver. In life, an invisible man written off for a tax deduction. My name is John Miller, I'm 59, and I've worked nights all my life in warehouses, in stores, in places where people rarely make eye contact. I've been the one who goes unnoticed. Until my own son and his wife decided to turn my name into a tool and my life into a stage set for other people's speeches. This story is not about revenge. It's a story about silence becoming a voice and deception becoming proof. Stay with me until the end of this story. I will show you how truth is born out of silence. Subscribe to the channel and listen carefully, because you may hear your life in these words. I heard his voice shake when I asked about money. "It's part of the family plan, Dad, it's easier for everyone," he said. The words were smooth, but his breathing was hitching, like he couldn't believe what he was saying himself. I listened and felt my palm go cold on the arm of the chair. He said a word that was foreign to me, "Arbear." I asked him what it was. He faltered, exhaled a chuckle, and said, "Legal structure, nothing serious." His laughter sounded like the creak of a poorly oiled door. I replied that I could count not only the coins in the bank, but also the $8,000 I had never seen. "Dad, let's get together, that'll clear things up." His voice was suddenly soft, as if that invitation could wipe out the empty shelves in my refrigerator. I agreed. When the call cut off, I opened my worn notebook, its pages smelling of warehouse dust. I scribbled out the date and address with a pen. The letters shook, but not from old age, but from the fact that for the first time something more than a note had lain within them. It was a mark that would never be erased. I didn't look for confirmation, but it began to come on its own. Maria whispered into the phone. I heard them screaming outside the door, her voice like a knife on glass. I remained silent, feeling my fingers clench the matchbook on the table so that the cardboard cracked. In the afternoon, Alan called. His words came in scraps. "I found more letters, but I'm being followed. I see the same car outside the office." I pictured him stashing the papers in an old bag, and I was prickled with guilt. Someone else's courage was worth more than my dream. That evening, I took out my notebook in a notebook with tattered edges. I wrote the text without names, just facts, just the cold lines of truth. "Lies come in a glass of champagne," I deduced, and the publish button became heavier than any hammer. The first comment appeared a minute later. Then the second. People wrote, "It's about me, too." Their words lay on the screen like someone else's palms on my back. The truth, spoken in whispers, suddenly became a chorus. The letter dropped into the mail without warning, like a stone down a well. The subject line was short, "I believe you." I opened it and felt my breath catch in my chest for a second, as if the air had gotten thicker. A man from Houston wrote that Olivia had already come to him, promised investments, painted showcases of future business, and then disappeared with his money. He confessed that, then hid the shame behind silence. His lines were not a confession, but a cry that had been held underwater for too long. I reread the letter and felt a shiver run through my fingers, as if the paper were a wire through which the current reached me. I forwarded the letter to Patricia. She replied almost immediately, "This changes the scale. It's no longer a fluke, but a pattern." I closed my laptop and stared out the window. Cars rushed by, people crossed the street, and suddenly it was clear the story had long since moved beyond my kitchen. It's no longer a family drama. It's a web of too many voices waiting to be heard. In the evening, Laura called so abruptly that the silence in the room cracked. She said, "We're meeting tomorrow. Time is not on our side." Her voice was firm, and the old gears of hope, long rusted but still alive, creaked inside me. The next day, Alan came up to me in the parking lot and shoved a thin folder into my hands. "I'm under the cameras, so make it quick," he whispered, his eyes running around like a man used to looking for a way out. The papers inside smelled of dust and fear, printouts of letters, notes in the margins, numbers that added up to someone else's bill. We parted in silence. I walked with the folder under my arm and suddenly caught a strange feeling. I was no longer alone. Laura with her cold mind, Maria with her quiet courage, Alan with his nerves stretched to the limit. All of them held some of the weight I had carried for years alone. But at home, when the door closed, the support dissolved like the light from the headlights outside the window. I sat down on the bed and pulled out an old notebook. Between the numbers and dates, the face of my son, the boy who had once held my hand on the crossing, suddenly surfaced. And I realized, support doesn't drown out the echo, it still comes back to the empty room. I found myself in a hall where the light fell too brightly, as if it wanted to burn out every shadow. The chandeliers sparkled, the glasses clinked, and the guests smiled so lusciously that the smell of their smiles mingled with the champagne. My son stood at the microphone, and every word he spoke sounded like the squeak of a needle on a record. I stood up. My legs didn't shake. "You applaud the lie, and I live its shadow," I said, and the silence in the hall became denser than a wall. Someone dropped a fork, someone coughed. For the first time in a long time, I spoke without a bridle, and every letter was sharp as glass. Olivia was staring straight at me, her gaze cold, but something like fear flickered in it. I slapped my palm on the table. The truth doesn't need advertising. It breathes on its own. Suddenly the audience fell silent, as if the air had been taken out of the room. I woke up. Sweat was pouring down my temples, my t-shirt was sticking to my back, and my heart was beating like it was timing someone else's time. I sat up, and the darkness of the room smelled like the iron of a pen left on the nightstand. Soon it would be dinner at the club, and the dream would no longer be a dream. I entered the hall, and the light of the chandeliers struck my eyes so sharply that my step became foreign for a second. White tablecloths, silverware, laughter. It was like a theater where tickets had long since been sold out. People nodded affably, but their smiles slid past like reflections in a shop window. In the center stood Daniel and Olivia. She held his elbow like a conductor holding a baton, and he nodded at every word unspoken. I could see the guests pretending to listen, even though they were waiting to show themselves in the light of the cameras. I sat down against the wall and noticed familiar eyes. Maria at the table with a glass, Alan at the exit with a still face. They nodded faintly, like a cipher in a crowd, and something inside me straightened, as if my spine had remembered its strength. The laughter died down, the waiters froze. The host held up a card and said, "And now the floor to our guest, Daniel Carter." The room froze, and the air grew thick as if before a thunderstorm. I stood up, and the chair behind me creaked so loudly that several heads turned. Daniel had already stepped toward the microphone, but I stepped ahead of him and took it in my hands. The metal felt cold in my palms, and that coldness felt like it anchored me in place. "First, I want to thank the waiters and those at the door," I said. "Without you, this room would have gone blind from its own dust long ago." The guests blinked, expecting a toast, but the words hung like a crack in the glass. I took a breath and added, "Now for the numbers." $8,000 a month, that's what he said. Loudly, to applause. But I come home to empty shelves and count not the bills but the cracks in the ceiling. That money exists only in his speeches. Someone coughed, someone lowered their eyes into their glass. The air became viscous. Daniel stepped forward. "Dad, this is misunderstood." His voice shook, and the audience murmured. The hall buzzed like a beehive, and every note of noise beat against his face. "He's right. I've seen the reports too. Those payments aren't in there," shouted someone from the audience, and the noise suddenly turned into a swarm. Daniel froze as if the words had fallen right on his shoulders and tried to smile, but the smile crinkled like paper on fire. I raised my hand, and the microphone trembled in my fingers. Words are party music. But when you put your signature down, the ink stays. The paper remembers. And I have the paper. People started whispering, someone pulled out their phone, recording every second. Olivia stepped forward, her heel clicking on the floor like a gunshot. "It's an old misunderstanding, everyone knows John doesn't always understand how business works," she said in a sweet voice, but the room no longer sounded trusting. A few guests turned away. Someone whispered to a neighbor, "Too many coincidences." I heard Alan's familiar cough by the exit, noticed Maria's gaze across the glasses. They nodded faintly, and the crack that had started in the hall began to spread further, turning into a road for my truth. "Danielle, do you support your father?" Helen's voice cut through the hall like a needle through cloth. She rose from the table, her eyes glittering, and for a moment all conversation fell silent. Daniel licked his lips, but the words stuck, as if his mouth had been filled with sand. The silence was broken by another voice, Thomas, a gray-haired man at the far table. "What about the checks with the initials ST? We all know whose letters those are." A hum went through the room like wind through leaves, and dozens of phones went up, recording every detail. I could see the red dots of the cameras flashing, and I knew there was no getting away from the footage. Olivia stepped forward, her bracelet jingling like a chain. "This is a private family matter, you don't understand," she said, but the voices continued. Spectators were turning into witnesses, and witnesses into judges. I clutched the microphone, preparing for it to be yanked out of my hands. But the club manager just stood against the wall, hands in his pockets. He didn't make a move, and that silence was louder than any blow. They left as if a door had slammed behind them, though the hall door remained open. Daniel stepped quickly, Olivia holding him by the elbow as tightly as if she was afraid he would fall. Their backs disappeared into the hallway, but the noise at the tables didn't stop. It changed direction like the wind after a thunderstorm. A woman with pearl earrings came up to me. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. We've all had too much faith for too long." Her fingers trembled as she placed a business card in my palm. Two more men followed her, then a student with a phone, a journalist with a notepad. Each handshake was unexpected, not pity, but recognition. I was no longer transparent. And suddenly Laura was beside me. She leaned over and said quietly, so only I could hear, "Now they can't turn back. The process is underway." There was no pathos or fear in her voice, only a husky hardness, as if a gear had caught on another and the mechanism had finally shifted. I stepped outside. The night air smelled of asphalt and wet leaves. I looked at my hands and realized that they were no longer shaking, and that was the loudest victory of the evening. The phone buzzed all day, as if it wanted to prove that I existed. Maria texted, "You were clear." Alan sent a short, "Now they see." Even neighbor Kelly left a note under the door, proud. The paper smelled like her perfume, and I caught myself rereading it like a letter from another time. Toward evening I got a call from Laura. The newspaper ran a story. "It's small, but your name's in it." For the first time, not in the accounting papers, but in the news. I bought the issue at the newsstand, held the paper in my hands, and the type seemed heavy, as if the letters themselves were pressing against my skin. People at the bus stop looked at me, and for the first time I didn't look away. During the night, the phone came alive again. "Daniel." His voice was as dry as broken glass. "You're destroying your family. Do you think they'll listen to you? I'll make you regret it." I remained silent, clutching the receiver, and felt sweat trickle down my back. But I was no longer a shadow to be drowned out by a threat. When the call cut off, silence fell over the room. I realized there was no turning back, and that road was now lit by a fire that could no longer be extinguished. At dawn, the mailbox rang as if stones had been thrown at it. The first letter was from Chicago. A man had entrusted Olivia with his savings and was working nights in a warehouse to pay off his debts. The second was from Atlanta, a woman describing how he'd sold his house for her startup promises. Each line throbbed with the same pain. I read them in the kitchen, a mug cooling in my hand, and my fingers numb from the number of open letters. "We kept silent because we were afraid of shame," one of them wrote. I stared at the screen and realized, these people, scattered across different cities, were like nodes in the same network. Laura called in the evening. Her voice was low. "All the stories match. We put the map together. The scale is different." I closed my eyes and imagined lines stretching out from the dots on the map, and in the center was not my kitchen, but an entire web. Sitting in the dark, I no longer saw myself only as a victim. I became a voice that could be heard instead of dozens. And in that voice I could already hear a different rhythm, the footsteps of the prosecutor's office preparing to enter the game. There was a knock on the door so that the glass in the frame shook. 2 men in dark jackets showed the warrant, and their voices were as dry as the paper they held. I stepped aside, letting them in. The apartment was immediately cluttered with the smell of rain and leather. Meanwhile, the news was on the TV, footage from my son's office agents carrying out boxes, thumb drives, folders. People on the street were picking up their phones, and flashes lit up their faces as if there had already been a trial. I looked at the screen and thought, here it was, the truth turned into a picture that couldn't be hidden. One of the agents handed me an envelope, found it at the notary's. I tore open the paper and saw my signature. Only it wasn't my handwriting, it wasn't my pen pressure. The lines were smooth, as if they were computer-generated, but my name was next to it. My knees buckled, and I grabbed the edge of the desk to keep from falling. I held the sheet with trembling hands. At that moment it was clear, they wanted to wipe me off the face of the earth and replace me with a painted copy. But it was that copy that would now be my weapon. The phone rang deep in the night, and the silence of the room shook like glass from a pebble. I picked up the phone, and immediately I heard his voice, tired, confused. "Dad, let's settle this the family way. No courts, no newspapers. We can come to an agreement." I was silent, and my heart was beating so loud I thought he could hear it over the line. "Give me the date of the first transfer," I said quietly. He blurted out, "In February." But I knew I'd spent February in the hospital, and no bank would have opened an account then. His pause cut my ear harder than a scream. "Okay, so where did we meet to sign the papers?" I asked again. He exhaled hastily, "At the notary on River Street." I closed my eyes. On the day he named, I was sitting in a warehouse hundreds of miles away. His version was crumbling like a house of cards. A second of silence. Then suddenly, "Dad." It was the first time I'd heard that word in months. But it didn't warm me, it rang hollow, like a coin in a bank that had long been empty of money. The connection broke, and I realized that the thread that held us together had already broken completely. The prosecutor's office was cold, the walls white and blank, as if on purpose to make a man talk more than he wanted to. Erin sat across from me, notebook open, pen ready. She nodded. "Start at the beginning." I talked about the night at the club, the empty shelves, the papers that weren't there. With each word, her pencil drew lines faster than I could breathe. Occasionally she looked up, a look of sharpness but no judgment. In the middle of the meeting, she flipped through the folder and said, "We found inconsistencies in the tax returns. Fake deductions, fictitious accounts. It's not just fraud within the family." My throat felt dry, like I'd swallowed ashes. Then she uttered a word that turned the room around: prison. I felt my heart thud against my ribs. There was no metaphor in that word, just iron and bars. Erin looked straight ahead. "If you're willing to go all the way, we'll take the case." I nodded, and for the first time my own voice sounded firm, "Yes." It was my step into a corridor from which there was no turning back. The envelope lay on the doorstep like a dead bird. Inside was an unsigned sheet of paper, "Shut your mouth while you can breathe." The letters were printed in bold letters, but between them I could smell someone else's fear. I squeezed the paper, and it crumpled so easily, as if it wanted to disappear on its own. 2 days later, a family friend showed up, a man in an expensive suit I'd only seen in photos next to Daniel. He sat down on my couch like he was the boss and placed a folder on the table. "We need to admit a mistake. One document and it's all over. You'll feel better," he said in a soft voice, as if you were offering medicine. I opened the folder. There lay a prepared confession. To emphasize that I had miscalculated and misunderstood the family arrangements. I ran my finger over the lines, then closed the folder and handed it back to him. "This paper is not mine. Take it back." His smile faded, and he got up and left without saying goodbye. The door closed behind him, and the room was left with the smell of his cologne and the folder that was no longer there. And I realized, the harder they pressed, the louder my truth sounded. The waiting was worse than the battle itself. The air in the courtroom was thick with the smell of coffee from the machine and the paper the lawyers were poring over. I sat in a hard chair and listened to the witnesses come in one by one outside the door. Maria, Alan, then Laura. Each step they took inside was like the beat of a metronome measuring my patience. I thought about how trust is the most fragile thing of all. If they faltered, my truth would crumble with them. But from behind the closed door came their voices, confident, steady, full of detail. I felt for the first time that their power was an extension of mine. By noon, the news headlines blared, "Olivia Carter ready to make a deal." My phone screen glowed in the palm of my hand, and I stared at those letters, unable to believe my eyes. The one who'd smiled down the hall with the mask of victory was now looking for a loophole. When the doors opened and the prosecutor stepped out, her face was focused but not anxious. She said briefly, "The jury is unanimous. Charges have been filed." And the words fell to the floor like a hammer, resoundingly, definitively. The courtroom breathed with other people's hearts. The wooden benches creaked as Aaron, the prosecutor, stood up first. "This case is not about family discord. This case is about systematic deception." Her voice sounded steady, each word laying like a stone in the foundation. The defense attorney rose to follow. "Our client was only trying to help his father, but his efforts were turned into an accusation," he said, and you could sense from his tone, he didn't fully believe it himself. I listened and felt the sweat running down my shoulder blades, leaving icy trails. When I was called to the podium, my legs felt like lead. I talked about the empty refrigerator, the papers I'd seen for the first time, the signatures I'd never made. "I'm not here for revenge, I'm here to reclaim my name," I said, and the room became quieter than a church. And then, suddenly, the unexpected. Olivia stood up on her own. Her voice trembled. "Yes, I signed some of the documents. Yes, the amounts were inflated." There was a murmur in the hall, even the lawyer blushed. The judge banged his gavel. "The jury is dismissed for deliberations." The doors closed and the air in the room became heavier than walls of stone. The jury door opened and 12 faces entered the room, tired but firm. The judge looked up from the papers. "Verdict?" The foreman of the jury nodded and held out the sheet. In the silence, even the rustling of the paper sounded like a thunderstorm. "Guilty on all counts." It sounded dry, unadorned. Those 3 words, simple and short, seemed to turn the air upside down. People in the audience whispered, someone sobbed, the cameras clicked, capturing a moment that could never be erased. I looked at my son. His face was pale as chalk, his lips moved, but no words came out. Nearby, Olivia clutched her bag so tight her knuckles turned white. She searched her eyes for a way out, but the walls of the hall were stronger than any door. I tilted my head and noticed the signature sheets on the table in front of the judge, the same ones where someone else's hand had tried to become mine. They were now their verdict. Paper had triumphed over words, and that triumph sounded louder than all the applause in the world. But as I left the hall, I realized that the verdict was not the final verdict. There was still life after it, and its pages were as blank as a sheet of paper. I stood in front of the audience, and the microphone was no longer a weapon, it became a bridge. People listened, and I told not about myself alone, but about those whose letters were kept in my folder. Each word fell through the air as lightly as a piece of paper, but in their eyes it had weight. In the mornings I wrote a column. The newspaper sent fresh issues, and I caught the smell of printing ink like I used to smell coffee. In the articles, I compared the truth to a kite. It reaches for the light, even if my hands are shaking. Sometimes it seemed to me that somewhere in the field this kite was flying over the head of a boy who did not yet know what betrayal was. One day, a letter arrived with a prison postmark. From Olivia. A few lines, no apology, no confession, just a dry, "You got what you wanted." I closed the envelope and put it in the drawer where the old keys were. The son didn't write at all. His silence was thicker than any letter. And now I ask you, if there is a similar shadow in your life, look into the paper. There may be more truth in it than words. Would you risk bringing it into the light? Sign up to hear how stories like this can end differently.